I didn't see a problem with the banner, to be honest, because the banner has been in the parade for decades. I find it really hypocritical that people are so offended by a banner, and yet the same people of England are playing Ireland, and the way that we react when England are playing in the World Cup, and everybody gets in on that.
Yeah, it's a bit different. Welcome to Ireland Unfiltered. We're joined this week by Lynn Boylan. Lynn lost her seat for Sinn Fein in the European elections in May, and it was one of the reasons why we decided to ask her in, because one of the things with this series is to kind of talk to people in a way that maybe they don't talk in conversation when they're on the sort of the circuit doing news shows or just answering questions about the issues of the day. And to talk to a politician about what it's like to be rejected by the electorate and the human emotions that brings out was something I found really interesting, because we, for very valid reasons, a lot of the time we have a sort of stereotypical view of politicians. We say what we like about them. We bracket them all in the same category. And it was interesting just to hear a politician talk about what it feels like. Whether you have sympathy for them or not doesn't really matter. It was just interesting to hear that. There's a lot more in this as well. We talked about a united Ireland, what that would look like, and how you actually achieve that if you want to achieve it at all. Lynn obviously does. And there was a lot more in this interview. Before we go to it, don't forget to subscribe on all the usual channels. And if you like the show, please leave a review. Lynn, welcome to Ireland Unfiltered.
Thanks for inviting me.
It's great to have you here. I was going to ask you first about, like, people have images of politicians, and it seems to be you can't look beyond the kind of or look to the human side of politics or politicians. And I'm just wondering, after the European elections in May and the result there, like, how does that feel? Like, that feeling when you lose your seat?
Yeah, well, it's gut-wrenching, really, to be honest. And especially, I suppose, in the nature of ours, was we didn't see it coming.
Yeah.
You know, I think other politicians, maybe if you're having like a lot of negative feedback that you sort of are preparing yourself. But like up until the exit poll, we really thought we were going to take the seat. Yeah. So yeah, it's emotionally very tough to take. And I think, like, I was talking to Pádraig McLaughlin, you know, who's married to my sister-in-law, and we were saying that unless you've been in that situation, it's actually really hard to explain it, because you don't want to egg it either, you know, because people say, oh, it's a little bit like grief, you know, because you have good days and you have bad days. Yeah. But, you know, because there are people in really bad situations and you're sort of going, like, you've lost your job and, you know, there's a lot worse that could happen to you. But it is emotionally very, very hard to take. You know, because at the end of the day, the people have rejected you. Yeah,
but that's what I was going to ask. There's a feeling of rejection.
Yeah, you know, and no matter how hard you've worked or you feel like you've done a good job, the people didn't think that. So that's it's been tough. But I suppose for the first few weeks, I was caught up in trying to tie up loose ends, and because of the nature of the European Parliament, is your office is in Brussels, and you've got to go over and talk to your team over there who, you know, are equally sort of reeling, and then deal with all of that and box up all your belongings and ship everything home. So it's really now, since July, when you're officially no longer an MEP, that it's starting to sink in.
Right. And what does that feel like then? Do you feel at a loose end?
Yeah, I mean, and the advice, I suppose, from a lot of people is, look, just take the time out. Don't, you know, feel under pressure to do anything. And so I'm taking that a little bit too literally probably for the last few weeks. There was a point at which I think my liver might have been pickled, because everybody just wanted to go out and have a drink with you and see you were doing okay. Yeah. So I kind of said, right, from the 1st of July, that needs to be knocked on the head. And so I'm doing a lot of running, training for the marathon, trying to read books that I haven't had the time to do. And But
you say you didn't see it coming. Like, did you get any sense when you were canvassing? Did you feel like, compared, because like in 2014 you got such a huge vote. Like what were your expectations this time?
Well, we knew it was a very different election. You know, the anger that was on the doors in 2014, and people were saying to you, there's no way I'm voting that party or that party, you know, so I'm going to vote for you. So there was a lot of people telling you. This time you weren't getting that.
Right.
The anger wasn't there, but what I kept saying was it was very flat. You know, there was just a lot of apathy, but there was no anger towards us. It was just people were sort of very cynical about politics in general, and a lot of doors not answering, but then those that were sort of going, what's the point? So you didn't take that as being directed at you necessarily. You were sort of going, okay, turnout might be a problem, but at the end of the day, you know, if you can convince enough people of why it was important to go out and vote, you should be okay. But clearly, you know, that level of apathy, you know, was also including for Sinn Féin.
Was that a sign that Sinn Féin were being viewed as kind of more of an establishment party, do you think?
I think so, yeah. I think that for those you were able to engage in conversations with, were sort of saying, you know, that they, and if you look at it from their perspective, they're going, you know, in 2014 we voted, and you voted, okay, it was a local election and a European election, so that doesn't really necessarily affect national politics, but people don't see it that way. So they're like, in 2014 we voted and nothing changed, and then we voted in 2016 and nothing has changed. My life hasn't improved, or so. What's the point? And, you know, people are, I suppose, unless you're really interested in politics, people just kind of look at it and go, no, like we took a chance in Sinn Féin, but nothing changed. And you're trying to explain, well, we're not in government. Yeah. But yeah, so you're sort of all being lumped in, and that anti-politics is now affecting, and also, I suppose, all the left-wing parties, because no one did well in this election. And again, independents seem to be where people go when they're feeling cynical about politics.
And do you think Sinn Féin needs, because, you know, there's been talk about, you know, that Sinn Féin would consider government with Fianna Fáil or Fine Gael, like, and you've said that you think it's time for a left alliance. Like, is that important that Sinn Féin distinguishes itself from the traditional parties?
Yeah, I mean, for me personally, I would hate the idea of going into coalition with Fine Gael or Fianna Fáil. I just don't think, if you're a smaller party, that you can. We know that the history shows that. And also, I just think that, you know, your policies are so different. You're never going to be able to achieve the change you want. So that's, for me, I would, if it came to a vote in Ardèche, I would certainly vote against going into government with them. But the problem is that you're sort of in a catch-22, because, you know, like if you say you're not going to go into coalition in advance, then immediately the media establishment writes you off and go, oh, well, you just want to be in opposition. You don't want to be in government. You're not a credible, you know, a choice for the electorate. And then if you say you want a left-wing coalition, you know, so yeah, I think it's a hard one for any party to balance. But personally, I would love to see what you're seeing in Portugal, which is a left coalition, and that includes, this was for them, the Social Democrats are the largest party there. But the interesting thing is that with that left-wing coalition, they're reversing a lot of the austerity measures, but they also did really well in the European elections. So, you know, it's proven, rather than a left wing going in with a right wing, which Labour did, the Social Democrats have actually benefited from leading up a left-leaning government. And is there anything, like, again, that separates Sinn Féin from the other left parties? Like Peadar Tobin said that, you know, the party needed to get back its sense, you know, being about, you know, economic injustice and wanting a united Ireland, and he felt that it had strayed too much. And he also said something about representatives not being treated well by the party. Like, did you recognise any of that? I suppose for me, well, we can talk about Peadar. Like, I knew Peadar, I got on very well with him because we worked a lot on the Moore Street stuff. I think Peadar treated Republicans in Sinn Féin really terribly, because he was given so much leeway during the repeal campaign to go out and voice his position. For people like myself who were unhappy with the party's position on repeal for years, kind of had to just suck it up and try and change it every year at Ardèche, and to see Peadar, I suppose, be given that amount of leeway and then walk away at the end of it. So I wouldn't take, in terms of how he was treated, I'd be very cynical about Peadar's intentions by saying that. I think Sinn Féin is absolutely a party of the left, but I suppose what distinguishes is, one, being a United Ireland party, but also we want to be in government. We actually really do want to be in government. We don't want to be just an opposition party and standing on the sidelines. I mean, I'd rather not spend my Saturdays out protesting. I would rather that you didn't have to go out and protest. So I think that is something that Sinn Féin is always looking at, is we do want to be in government. We do want to be able to affect the change, and we want a united Ireland. And that, I suppose, is what distinguishes us from other left-wing parties. You know, so some of the left-wing parties are not in favour of a united Ireland, and I think that some.
And can you work with those parties? How big? You know, can you work with those parties? Do you think if they don't want a united Ireland?
I think you can work on a platform. You can, I think the Right to Change was a really interesting project that showed that some on the left are actually willing to work together, and some, of course, aren't. But I think you can have a common platform of what are the key issues that you want to achieve, and work together for those and put that to the electorate. I mean, for us, the United Ireland then is just something that's just overarches all of our policies. But I mean, I can't say that if you had a left-wing government that, it's health, it's education, it's housing, it's those issues that you're going to form common ground on. Yeah,
now we might come back to that in a minute. I just wanted to ask you then about, we're sitting in Dublin 8, like you were born not far from here. You grew up in Patrick Street?
In Patrick Street, in the Ivy Trust buildings. Yeah, well, for 2 years, but spent a lot of years coming back and forth in because my mother loved the city centre.
Okay.
So before I started school, she brought me in.
And you moved out to Tallaght when you were 2?
Yes, yeah.
And like that was a big upheaval, was it, for your family?
I have very tiny memories of the city centre, but more not because I had them when I was 2, but because I came back in and out a lot as a child. But like I loved Tallaght. I loved where I grew up, and I'm very proud to say I'm from Tallaght. And but for the rest of my family, and particularly my mother, found it really, really difficult leaving the city centre and never really kind of settled in Tallaght. Always had it in her head that she'd love to move back into the city centre. Just never managed it.
Okay, so she'd just bring you in every day.
Yeah, she'd make us drive past her house and Harty Place just to show us and say,
Really?
Yeah, she really just never got over it.
And would she kind of feel nostalgic and romanticise it, and like, it must have been a real sense of loss if she was doing that?
Yeah, absolutely. Just loved this area, just loved the liberties and, walking back and forth. She worked in Winstanley Shoe Factory and would walk in and out from work and come home for a lunch. And she just absolutely loved the Clonbrassil Street and that whole area. Whereas, it's for me, I loved Tallaght because that's my memories of growing up there, and the freedom you had because you'd huge open spaces and, most of it wasn't built up. So like you'd go off in the morning and come back when you got hungry.
Okay.
But,
and your father was a butcher initially and then a bus driver?
Yeah. So my dad trained as a butcher and worked in Cork Street for years. But then during the 80s, job after job closed down, and he was a milkman for a while in Jobstown. And he then tried selling fish. My dad is one of those people who, I suppose, that you never not work. You'll always go out. And like when we were growing up, if he didn't have the money to put in the petrol in the car, he'd go on his bike and find a job. Right. So he has this really incredibly strong work ethic. And then he eventually got into Dublin Bus when I was about 12. And that was the first time ever, sort of as a family, that you had that sort of stability of, a regular income.
Okay.
And, for him, it was incredible because it just meant he had job security for the first time.
And you noticed that as well then, presumably?
Oh, absolutely. The change it meant for, as a family, just that you could plan things and, you get stuff done on the house and just little things. But it was just a comfort because it was just seemed every job you went into just closed down. That's sort of my memories of my childhood.
Right. And was that then, because I read that you wrote a letter to the Evening Herald when you were 12, is that right?
Yes.
Was that sort of developing a social conscience, even that knowledge of seeing the difference between him in work and looking for work and things like that? Or where was it coming from?
Yeah, I didn't come from a political family, so there was no party politics in the house, but my dad did have a big influence on my life and still does, but he would sort of talk about things, and trade unionism, and he was always a member of a trade union, and, the importance of workers' rights, and, and he would bring you into museums as well every weekend, and maybe because they were free, it was something to do with the kids.
Right, yeah.
And, and he would talk about the lockout and things like that, sort of instilled that kind of, I loved my Irish history, and then, like, he even told another story of a man coming to work in the meat factory with him who was black, and no one would sit at the table with him. And, my dad getting up and going and sitting at the table. And, like, those sort of things stick with you as a child, because you're sort of going, like, that's how, you can't take in the fact that somebody would be so openly racist, in the 80s. But so I think my dad was responsible for that sort of social justice side of me. And then he went out, they were out on strike in Dublin Bus, and the Herald had a big headline about the usual, would they attack the workers and the chaos and it was going to cause. So I felt compelled to write a letter to defend my dad.
Right.
But also, I think the line in it was, James Larkin would be turning in his grave. So it shows you I was like going to the museums, and all of that was sort of feeding into.
And when you saw it and that appeared, they published it.
And they published it, and it was incredible to see your letter in the paper. And for me, that was the awakening of going, wow, you actually have a voice.
Right.
You can use your voice to. Yeah.
And was that something, because the 80s was such a volatile time, and it was a terrible time in Ireland in so many ways, like for women, for working class people, for there was so much unemployment and everything. So, like, was it a time that you felt like at everywhere you looked, if once your conscience was engaged, there was something that would prick it?
Yeah, and I suppose anyone who knows me from sort of from the time I went from my teens, like from 12 onwards, would say I was very opinionated and very argumentative, and like the nickname in the house for me was Nell. Because I was always talking about feminism and equality, and my mother was quite conservative, so we were always going head to head on fighting over various issues, whatever it was the issue of the day for me.
She would be on the other side.
She'd be usually on the other side, So she was kind of very traditional of, stay at home. And
And you've two sisters.
I have two sisters.
Yeah, and were they political?
No, not at all.
Right, okay.
No, it wasn't. So it wasn't a political house. It was just I, for some reason, was very political, and my teens very opinionated.
I've read as well that you said, like, at that stage, like, you were political, and one of your elder sister had a vote, and you were encouraging her to vote Sinn Fein.
Yeah.
Where was that coming from?
Yeah, I think the reason for Sinn Fein was partly of my love of history. So that sort of, like going to museums and learning a lot. And Kilmainham was my favourite place to go to as a kid. So I had a love of Irish history, and so always had been a United Irelander.
Yeah.
And then sort of the left-wing politics as well coming into it. And so I think that was a combination that I sort of found it by myself. And my sister, who wasn't political at all, he sort of said, I'll go with you and help you fill in the ballot sheet.
But like Sinn Fein at that stage, because of the IRA and things like that, it wasn't like a question of some sort of romantic notion of United Ireland. They were pursuing it through like violent means. Like, how did you reconcile that with any kind of feeling you had about social justice?
Well, I think the history of the state is violence. I mean, and I think that, because time allows, the people sort of say is sort of the good IRA, the bad IRA. I mean, some of the things that were carried out during the War of Independence were horrific. So we have a violent past. There's no political party in the country, bar probably the Greens, that don't have violence in their past. So, and like I had done my Leaving Cert thesis on Michael Collins and how his time in Frangach camp actually is what brought him to the realisation that you'll never be able to take on the British Army by normal military means, by wearing a uniform and trying to meet them force to force, that you're going to have to use guerrilla warfare tactics. So I do think that, what happened during the conflict, there's absolute atrocities, but at the same time there was atrocities all throughout. Ballyseedy massacre was another atrocity, and it seems like, you know, in Ireland you can talk about the IRA up until a certain point, and then at that point it's like, you know, they become the bad IRA, and for me I find that quite difficult to reconcile.
So you saw them as a straight continuation?
I would say that you would rather that the conflict didn't happen, but I think the context is really important as to how it came about, and the civil rights protests, and the fact that the southern state didn't look after the Catholic community in the north played a huge part in the conflict that followed, and that's not justifying some of the things that took place, but I do think that you can be very hypocritical if you don't look at the context, but also if you think that it was okay to have violence prior to the...
How have your views evolved on it? Like, because you say that, and like the southern states, like we had Charlotte Burns on the show a few months ago, who, you know, is from South Armagh and is like, you know, would consider himself a Republican and a nationalist. And he says that one of the mistakes Republicanism made is they never factored in unionism. He said that we thought we were at war with Britain, but what we were doing was creating a siege mentality among unionists, which now makes it even harder to achieve a united Ireland. Would you think that's a fair analysis?
I think that, like, possibly that, you know, the fact that you have a partitioned small state automatically forces people into their, you know, what they identify with, and the you know, the emblems, the culture, the identity of it. So you don't know. We don't know. Do you know what I mean? Like, that's all hypothetical.
Well, I suppose we can see it in the like in the sense of the sensitivity and the sense of isolation and hostility, you know, many unionist people have towards Ireland and any aspirations towards a united Ireland. And also, I guess, if you, I know what you're saying, but if you're also killing members of that community, like RUC men, stuff like that, it's very hard then to say we're also interested in reconciliation. But
it's, look, I think it is important. Reconciliation is key. It's one of the stumbling blocks to the Assembly getting back up and running is around the legacy issues and having that proper reconciliation process. But what you'll see within the unionist community, I mean, there is a shift, certainly post-Brexit, looking at the possibility of a united Ireland. But also, there's a huge chunk of the population in the north that don't vote, middle-class unionists who are from the unionist tradition, but they're not represented by the unionist parties. So they just don't go out and vote. And you know, they're the people you need to reach out to, because they're not having any political leadership within their own community. You know, and at the moment, I mean, I suppose it's the 12th of July and we're seeing the bonfires and the lack of political leadership within the unionist community to deal with that. But there is a huge cohort of unionists who are not represented and don't vote.
No, I get that. And how do Sinn Fein reach out to them? That's what because one of the things, like I lived away from Ireland for a long time, and one of the things that struck me when I came back was just like, we talk about a united Ireland, and that's fine, but then we have this just sort of knee-jerk hostility, which it comes for lots of understandable reasons, to the people who we say we want to unite in this Ireland. So, like, do you see what I mean? How do we reconcile those two things and actually reach out to them? Well,
you do, but I mean, like, Sinn Féin does a lot of work in terms of reaching out and also through civic society and engaging in that way. And I mean, on the Brexit communities or the border communities against Brexit, you know, is cross community things. So I mean, we do a lot of work, but like, I think, you know, this idea of a united Ireland, just sort of like, workers haven't been represented by the partition state, regardless of whether they're from the nationalist or the unionist community.
No, I get that.
And, you know, so trade unionism becomes sectarian. Everything becomes, do you know what I mean? Just like, it's impossible to unite people around it, whereas they would benefit. So those who are trade unionists would actually benefit under a united Ireland. Equally, I mean, around the other aspects of social justice and marriage equality and abortion rights. So there's benefits to all communities in the north in
it's
a united Ireland.
It's so bad that, like, from the point of view of Northern Ireland and like power sharing at the moment, that the House of Commons, where Sinn Fein won't even go, is now actually the ones who are introducing same-sex marriage and abortion into Northern Ireland. So, like, it doesn't give you much hope for how the communities can work together.
But again, it's the failure of political leadership.
But including by Sinn Fein.
Well, the abuse of the petition of concern. I mean, how many times has marriage equality and abortion has been tried to be brought to the Assembly and has been blocked, and the petition of concern has been abused by the unionist political parties. But I think really interesting seeing some of the commentary on Twitter about those Westminster votes. I mean, I'd much rather that the Assembly was legislating for the people of the North. Again, my preferred option would be United Ireland, and the Dáil would be legislating for the 32 counties. But it does show the lack of interest, or how political opponents look at the North and use it only just as a political football when it suits them to have a go at Sinn Fein. I'm not saying Sinn Fein is not a perfect party, and there's lots of mistakes we've made, but you've seen some of the commentary around Westminster and saying it's great that this has happened, because the Assembly couldn't do it. Now, the Assembly have been trying to introduce these, have been trying to introduce issues around equality, and it keeps getting blocked. And that's why the Assembly, while it was the RHI scandal, brought it down. It's why it's not back up and running, because you can't go back to that status quo. And if only those in the South who are commenting to have a go at Sinn Fein now, because Westminster has passed this, were actually showing the same interest in making sure that those red line issues, those rights-based issues, were actually resolved so that we could get the Assembly up and running. That would benefit people, as opposed to just political point scoring.
Yeah, that's what but I guess it is because you talk about, the work Sinn Fein have done, and maybe you're right, maybe it will always be overshadowed by mistakes Sinn Fein make or a misstep, but perhaps that's also the price that the party still pays for its legacy, if you like, because, I'm wondering, when you say reconciliation, do you also have to keep the more traditional wing happy? I'm thinking about Mary Lou MacDonald in front of the England Get Out, or behind the England Get Out of Ireland banner at St. Patrick's Day, and how that tallies with a tolerant kind of, extending the hand of friendship idea.
I think Sinn Fein wants reconciliation. We want those legacy issues resolved. For me, as a member of Sinn Fein, I do find it really frustrating the way that everything is just seized upon. No matter what you do, it's just seized upon as for political gain. And victims. There's a hierarchy of victims in the southern establishment. So one victim is put up and exploited for political gain, and which is wrong, because you're exploiting people's pain and people's hurt, as opposed to let's get reconciliation for all victims of the conflict. And you don't see the same enthusiasm or the same political attention drawn to other victims. And for me, I think that has to be part of the healing process of the North, is that we have to have a formal reconciliation process, but we have to stop making political footballs out of victims on all sides of the conflict. And that for me really upsets me when I see that done by politicians and by the media.
So you think it's only, when you see that picture, you don't think, oh, that's not the right message? If we're trying to, when I see Sinn Féin's statement afterwards explaining that they're not really referring, and I get the whole historical context and I understand the historical significance of the banner and all that stuff, that's fine. But surely when Sinn Féin are releasing a statement explaining we don't really mean English people leave Ireland, that's not a good place to be for the party.
I suppose, look, I didn't see a problem with the banner, to be honest, because the banner has been in the parade for decades. I find it really hypocritical that people are so offended by a banner, and yet the same people of England are playing Ireland, and the way that we react when England are playing in the World Cup, and everybody gets in on that.
Yeah, it's a bit different. Like
Sinn Féin. When I lived in Kerry, my next door neighbour was from London, and she hated it. She couldn't understand. She said she felt awful when she'd go in to watch England playing in a football match, and that the Irish, everybody in the pub would be against the English. So we all engage in that sort of old rivalry,
but Sinn Féin are bringing something else to it. Like, that's what I'm saying. Like, you can't, at one hand, say this banner is historical and it's always been there, and then ask people to say, well, just look at this the same way you would look at, cheering, wanting England to lose in a football match, and forget about Sinn Féin's history in that regard, to the IRA's campaign of terror. Like, it's hard to say. They're not really.
I think that I personally look at the banner, and of course it's saying England. It's not saying English people.
No, I get that.
Yes, but do we not want a united Ireland? Do we not want England to finally leave?
We know, and I know,
having a role on this island.
England will get out of Ireland as, like, given any excuse, Britain will get out. Like, one of the most likely things that's going to happen once Boris Johnson becomes Prime Minister is that he'll betray the DUP. Like, they will cut Northern Ireland adrift as quickly as they can. If Theresa May hadn't had to rely on them for votes in the last Parliament, she would have cut them adrift before now. So ultimately it comes back to that Charlotte Burns point that it's not about Britain anymore. It's about how we reconcile unionist people and the rest of the country.
But I think it's Brexit. If to look at it from a unionist perspective, Brexit has really put the spotlight on how little the rest of Britain cares about the north of Ireland.
No, I agree.
And that's
absolutely.
why those conversations and why Brexit has presented this opportunity to actually go into unionist communities and say, your life will be much better in a united Ireland, and you will be respected much more than you are in terms of being part of Britain. I mean, and that's the conversations you have to have. And I think it must be, for a lot of unionists, it must be really hurtful to see how little regard was given to their situation in the Brexit debates, but also post-Brexit, how little concern is given around Boris Johnson, and he wants his Brexit, and it doesn't matter that it's going to destroy the lives of the people in the 6 counties. And I think as a unionist, that must be really, really hard to sit and to watch.
But isn't that the point then? Like, when you say we need a conversation about a united Ireland, what I'm interested in is, what is that conversation, and how do we involve the people who don't want to be part of United Ireland, or maybe, as you say, are now confused and like wondering where their identity lies? How do we invite them into that conversation in a way that isn't hostile?
But that's why, I suppose, what Sinn Féin is saying is that the government need to prepare for the referendum and for a border poll, because Sinn Féin are not going to deliver a united Ireland. And I have made this point at conferences we've had. We're United Irelanders, and there will be a point at which this will become a popular campaign if there is a referendum, and we'll have to hand it over because others will take up the gauntlet, because that's what happens. It's the same with repeal. You had people who'd campaigned for decades for abortion rights, and then all of a sudden everybody is out campaigning and claiming that they delivered repeal. So Sinn Féin cannot do this alone. And that's what we're saying to the government is there's going to be a situation, especially Brexit has crystallised the atmosphere now around that this is going to happen. We are going to have a border poll at some point. We should be preparing for that. And that means having civic society, having trade unions come on board, have the farming organisations, those other organisations that reach out to different sectors, talking about it and preparing and listening to people's fears and putting in place what sort of model of a united Ireland will we have? Will it be a phased in approach? So, like, we want the conversation to happen, but we can't dictate it. We can't be the only ones talking about it, because we will never deliver a united Ireland on our own.
When do you think there should be a border poll?
I would like to see within the next 5 years.
Right.
But again, because I followed the Scottish independence referendum very closely and went over and was there for the referendum. What was really interesting was the body that came out called the Common Weal, and that was grassroots, started out in community centres, a little bit like the Right to Water did here. They went in and they talked to people and said, this is not just about Scottish independence, because, it's like in Ireland, 32 state Ireland, like if we have the same government and the same policies, that's not the United Ireland I want to see. And that's what they did in Scotland. So they were like, this is the potential or the opportunity to actually have a new republic and to have, do you know what I mean, different politics that the Tories will no longer be able to dictate for us. And that for me was really interesting. The SNP, I have huge respect for a lot of what they do, and they're doing fantastic work in Scotland. But the Common Weal was the really interesting part of the referendum. Now, okay, they didn't win, but they went out and were making those arguments and talking to young people about why their future would be so much more positive in a United Ireland. And that's what I'd like to see in a United Ireland referendum, is that it's making the case a really positive, hopeful way of saying your life will be improved. Everybody's life could be improved in a United Ireland.
Do you think, when you say Sinn Fein can't deliver it on its own, like, do you think almost there's a case where Sinn Fein should almost, if you want a United Ireland, Sinn Fein should almost stay out of it because of the fact that maybe you feel unfairly, I think, it's legitimate, but there will always be these allegations put against Sinn Fein when they're involved in it?
Well, I think if the referendum was to be called, you're going to need a Together for Yes, a marriage equality type umbrella organisation to deliver it. And I think that's beneficial rather than any political parties. Like, political parties can take their position on it. And I mean, it's no surprise Sinn Féin's position on a referendum on a United Ireland. But I think you need to have that umbrella organisation in order to deliver it and to go out and to convince different people.
And you don't think a border poll now, because one of the things that's been said is that this would just add to, we're in Brexit has caused such chaos that a border poll would just be adding, our own kind of version of the Brexit referendum, which wasn't thought out and wasn't this wasn't anticipated.
If it's not thought out and if it's not planned for correctly, then yes. But that's why we're saying it's coming. Right. At some point, this is going to come, and why not start planning for it? Why not start looking at how you'd implement it and how you'd have a proper conversation around United Ireland? And having those conferences, having those community hall meetings and going in and talking to communities, not just in the north, because I think there'll be people in the south you'll have to convince as well to vote for it. And there'll be nationalists who won't vote for United Ireland, because all the questions around, well, what about the HSE versus the NHS? Yeah. So you have to have all of those conversations. But if you carried out a referendum in the same way that the Brexit referendum was, of course you're not going to win it. But if you plan for it correctly, which is why I said...
But you might win it, but it might cause more chaos, is what I'm saying.
Not if it's planned properly. Right. And that's what I'm saying. If you look at the Scottish independence referendum, even though, if they voted no, they're still now in a position where they're talking about having another one. Yeah. But they looked at it and they did it in a really mature and considered approach to a referendum as opposed to the Brexit one. And equally in I'm following Catalonia very closely as well, and it's really interesting there because again, it's the civic society that's driving the conversation and not any one political party.
Where do you think Brexit is going to go? Because you've spent 5 years in Europe. There is more pressure now coming on. Both candidates for the Tory leadership are talking about leaving with no deal if they have to. The pressure, Ireland is talking about the calamity of no deal for Ireland, which I think has been overlooked, and that situation may be the worst possible outcome for Ireland. From what you know of Europe, having been there for the last 5 years, do you think they're going to remain as steadfast in support of Ireland if it comes really down to the crunch over the next few months?
Not at all. The EU looks after itself,
right,
and always puts its
but
interests.
we're part of the EU, are we?
We are, but the EU is bigger than member state, and when it comes to it, at the end of the day, trade trumps everything in the EU's mind, and we have seen them throw countries literally under the bus when it suited them. So yes, Ireland will come under intense pressure, whether to sacrifice something in order, they'll have to still hold firm on the backstop. The Irish government will have to hold firm, but they will come under a huge amount of pressure because the single market has to be maintained.
But if there's a choice between the backstop and no deal, what does Ireland choose?
Well, like Ireland we have to defend our interests. What my concern is that everybody's saying that the EU thinks, the EU has shown a huge amount of solidarity to Ireland. It's defended Ireland's corner. No, it's exploited the situation of Ireland to send a very clear message to every other EU country. Don't even consider leaving because they can't see that it'd be easy to leave. And, so all these people thinking that the EU is wonderful and is a great friend of Ireland, it's like, no, Ireland is a really useful tool for the EU to send a very clear message to the likes of Italy and those countries who are considering whether or not to hold a referendum. So for us, it's more important that the government holds the line. Yeah. Because I would never trust what happens within the EU.
But when you say hold the line, I'm just wondering, when you look at their projections for what happens with a no deal, do you hold the line on the backstop even if it means no deal and probably a border anyway? Like, I don't know, like that's the problem, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, but the backstop has to be the bare minimum. You cannot compromise on the backstop. The peace on the island is too important for us to look at putting any sort of infrastructure up on the island of Ireland. I mean, and the interesting thing, the backstop, when it first happened in Brexit, we put forward this special status case and we were laughed out of the room, people saying that's impossible. The backstop is the special status. We have to insist that the backstop is maintained and that any border checks or anything move out to the Irish Sea. And don't happen on the island of Ireland. I mean, that has to be the red line for the Irish government.
There's other European, like, what did you make of the Irish government's decision not to put forward another candidate when they were requested alongside Phil Hogan, a female candidate? Did that surprise you?
No. I mean, they were asked in the last term to also, Jean-Claude Juncker had requested that if countries put forward female candidates for commissioners, that they would be given better portfolios, because he was trying to increase the number of women in the commission. And at that opportunity, we were being tipped to get the agriculture portfolio. And you had somebody who, while I disagree with them politically, Mairead McGuinness was perfectly qualified for that position, and the Irish government chose to send Phil Hogan, who had left disasters in his wake as a minister. So it doesn't surprise me in the slightest.
But it doesn't give the idea that, like, that EU commissioners are anything other than a reward for party service. It's hard to shake that when you see things like that happening, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, interestingly, at the time, because the Parliament are given an opportunity to question the commissioners in their committees, but like, it's all a box ticking exercise. So they come in, they give a speech, you get to ask your question, and then they take the questions in a group. So they just don't answer the questions they don't like. But what I found really interesting, because we were talking about Phil Hogan and the things he had done and his legacy, and then you started looking at some of the other candidates and you were like, actually, in the grand scheme of things, in one case you had a prime minister who knew she was going to lose an election, so she nominated herself for a commission. The Spanish commissioner who, when he was Minister for Agriculture, made sure that the cap covered bulls for the bullfighting. So and had shares in the oil industry, and he was going to be commissioner for climate change. So it was sort of you kind of go, God, like, I thought we were bad, but actually
it's okay.
there was there were some very choice candidates.
How do you feel like things are progressing then with, like, because you talked about the vote at the European election, but the Greens did get, it wasn't as huge as was heralded with the exit poll, but there was, Kieran Cuff was elected. There was a sense of people embracing Green ideas to some degree. But, like, do you feel there's a real intent to match whatever the people have said in that vote from the government?
No, absolutely not. I mean, the fact that they would be continuing to issue exploration licenses just makes a mockery of, supporting the call for climate emergency.
Yeah.
The type of measures that have to be taken to tackle climate change, and I think the problem is they're sold negatively all the time, that we're all going to have to go back to, the dark ages, and instead of actually looking at it as a really positive thing, do you mean, and that there's huge positives to people in changing our lifestyles. But I don't think that, but certainly the Fine Gael government aren't taking climate change seriously. And I mean, Climate Action Network had found that they had played a negative role in all of the climate negotiations at an EU level and at an international level. But if they were serious about it, you have to leave whatever fossil fuels are in the ground. That has to be the starting point. And the killing off of Breed Smith's climate bill shows you that they're not prepared to take climate change seriously. But it will be interesting to see whether the electorate, it's different in the second order election to send a message to the government, than in a general election. Do they actually really want, are people really up for the changes? Yeah,
but they've also then the EU, the trade bill with South America now, that again seems to fly in the face of whatever you should be saying to farmers about climate change.
Yeah, I'm kind of a bit amused at the outrage around the Mercosur trade deal, because all of the trade deals to date that the EU have negotiated come with their own environmental consequences and their consequences for jobs and for. So it is interesting, and I suppose it shows you the power of the farming lobby in Ireland, that Mercosur is suddenly this huge problem for climate change when you're looking at TTIP and CETA and all these other trade agreements. Yeah. I mean, we need to be moving away from globalization to localization.
But I suppose it also shows that if you're trying to persuade, like, and I take your point, they're a very powerful lobby, but when you're trying to persuade, an agricultural country like Ireland that we need to change, that then this happens, it's very hard to bring people with you.
Yeah, I know it's a joke to tell farmers to reduce their herd, but we're going to import beef from a country that's, cutting down rainforests and apart from all the other issues around the current president there, it's completely hypocritical. And I don't think the farmers are wrong. I think they're absolutely right to be jumping up and down and pointing out the hypocrisies of it. But what I would like to see from the farming lobby is that they have showed the same interest when it comes to all the other trade deals. So, I mean, we're talking about Mercosur, but they've no issue around, increasing trade to Asia and to Japan and China and selling powdered milk. So farmers are picking this trade deal because it impacts on them. So I think they're right, and I think they're pointing out the hypocrisy of what the government is saying and what the environmental sector is saying to them. You need to reduce your herd, but they're picking and choosing which trade deals because this one doesn't suit them.
Leo Varadkar has, like, he came in on on some sort of a wave of, like, that he was a progressive leader of for a new Ireland. Like, has the kind of altering view of him surprised you? I know what you're going to say.
Do you? What am I going to say?
No.
I never thought I'd miss Enda.
I didn't know you were going to say that.
No, I think Leo...
Has he surprised you then?
No, not in the slightest.
Has he disappointed you?
No, he hasn't. Okay. He has lived up to what I expected him to be, who's somebody who's clearly in politics for... Well, I would see it, in my opinion, somebody who's in it for their own personal gain, and seems to show a very considerable lack of empathy a lot of the time. But he hasn't surprised me in the slightest. It's exactly what I have expected him to be. Somebody who can shift their position on, really fundamental issues just because it's suddenly become the popular thing to do is a bit concerning,
And you say, like you look at the issues then that Fine Gael and the government are failing to deal with, like housing being the one that causes most anxiety for people in the country, probably. Again, we've had Leo Varadkar on here. We've had Micheál Martin on, who said it was a class issue that people weren't building, that the government weren't building homes. Do you think it's solvable with the right appetite and with the right desire?
Yeah, I mean, you only have to look at other European countries to see that you can have a properly functioning housing market, where a lot of countries are struggling around housing issues, but in Ireland we have this, I suppose, push to home ownership as being seen as being the only way that you can have a secure roof over your head, and that's been incentivised by government after government, but also at the same time, simultaneously, the government stepping away from having responsibility for housing people, and the government's attitude is to create this narrative that public housing is only for those who somehow failed in life. This idea of it's social housing, and that these people are failed people, and everybody else can actually manage to either rent in the private sector or to buy their own home, and that's very damaging on society, I think, for both the people who are living in social housing, but also just for the perception. You hear people going like, "You're getting houses for free." Nobody gets a house for free, regardless of if they're in a council house or if they're, in a rental property. There is nobody in this country getting a house for free. But that narrative is put out there because of the type of politics, particularly of Fine Gael, but equally of Fianna Fáil, which is, the state doesn't provide houses except for those in extreme need. But it can be fixed. Absolutely. And I mean, we can have the model, like I suppose everybody looks at sort of the Vienna model in Austria, where, why shouldn't working professionals live in public housing?
Is that something that links into as well, something about the class structure of Irish society? We still, is there enough diversity in Ireland in public life? You've grew up in Tala, Lynn Rowan has been on this show, who again speaks so strongly about the divide in Dublin, not knowing, where bringing her uncle into Trinity for the first time when he was 80 years old, he'd never stepped foot in there, that kind of 2-tiered, 3-tiered society that still exists. What has to be done to change that as well?
Well, we do need greater diversity, especially in the voices that you hear in the media, that you need to hear different accents and different backgrounds to reflect the society that we live in. But equally, we need to be educating young people, particularly from working class backgrounds, as to, what their potential is, and to make sure that they maximise their potential. And that's something for me that's for the last 5 years, because I love working with teenagers, especially, and when I lived in Kerry, I would teach ecology to teenagers, and particularly loved when you'd get the ones at the school would be coming going, "Oh, that's a tough school you've got today," and I always just enjoy. I mean, I suppose it's because it's where I'm from. But when I got elected, one of the things I did was to go out to schools and sort of talk. Basically pinpoint schools that are in working class areas and bring those students out to Brussels to show them the European Parliament. Right. And what struck me, we linked up with Gaishke to do a pilot project. So they had to study a topic for 12 weeks and make a video on it. And we did that for 3 years, I think it was. But one of the groups was from Skerries, and they did a video on youth unemployment and very working class kids, and their potential jobs was what they looked at in their area. And it really struck me and there was nothing wrong with the jobs, but it was just their ambition was obviously capped at that point. So it was like a soccer coach with the FAI, fishing, or Tesco's. and that was the 3 jobs, and you're looking going, but why wouldn't you look at the possibility of being a doctor or being a lawyer or
how do we, that seems to be, you could change that very quickly, that attitude, by education.
Yeah, I mean, and that's why that I went to Gaishka to sort of say, look, I really have this idea that I'd love to do, because I was meeting young people coming out to the European Parliament and they were part of the youth parliament and that, and I was like going, these are already kids who they're going to be fine. Do you know what I mean? They've got the opportunities. They're very well educated, but how do we show, a kid from Jobstown that equally you can be here? Yeah. You could be in the European Parliament, and why not? Whether it's working in the policy area, whether it's as an elected rep. So that's why I went and kind of did that project, and it's probably one of the things I'm really proud of, like having brought 200 young people over the course of the 5 years out to Brussels to get them to sort of see there's a wider world outside of where you're from. But college is beyond the means of a lot of kids, even just around the fees and and just if they don't see, if their parents didn't go to third level, then I'm the first in my family to go to third level education. And that was a real struggle. But so I think we've a lot to do in going into schools and ensuring that kids stay in school, but also that they understand that they have huge potential.
You talked there about diversity of voices in the media. I'm wondering what you think about the future of media in a broader sense in Ireland now. If it's sustainable. If you think it is changing for the better in certain ways, if things are improving?
I don't think it is improving.
No.
I think there's some incredibly talented journalists in Ireland, and I'm always careful because I suppose for Sinn Fein we get a lot of criticism in the media, but a lot of Sinn Fein members will just go on the attack then, and I'll see it on social media and they'll just criticise, that's just the media and they're all the same. And I would say no, there's areas where you're right to criticise, but there's a lot of really incredibly good journalists. But also I studied journalism when I first left school, and the idea of journalism being a career for life and, a good job is gone. It's a really precarious job now, and that impacts on the type of stories that journalists can cover. So what I would like to see in Ireland, and that was the report that we had commissioned back in 2015, looking at media ownership, the call for that was that you would set up a commission to look at how do you sustain a properly functioning media in a small country, and what that needs to do. So how do you have, that RTE is functioning as a public broadcaster? How do you ensure that print media is sustainable into the future? So I don't have all the answers to it, but I think that we have huge problems in Ireland around our media, and the lack of diversity of voices. There isn't any left-wing voices really. There's no left-wing shows on the radio or, it's just completely lacking. Just differences of opinions, and, you've got a public broadcaster where you have one presenter interviewing another presenter for a show, and it's all so closed. But I would like to see that happen, that there's other European countries who are supporting media and funding it without interfering, because you've got to be really careful to have the separation, but they're doing it. Whereas what we saw with, I think it was Minister Naughton at the time, saying we'd use, some of the licence fee and we'd give it to the print media. But if you just give it to them, are the media going to run with the stories that they would say are popular, which is around, it could be like entertainment or popular culture. Whereas in other countries they have funds, but you apply because you're an investigative journalist, and it's, you go with the story as opposed to giving it to the newspapers. And I'd much rather see that type of model set up, so that it's not telling journalists what they need to be working on, but you're ensuring that it's good quality investigative journalism that's being subsidised by the state.
And you studied journalism. I'm wondering what's next now.
Not journalism.
Not journalism, no. You just painted a pretty bleak picture of it. I don't blame you.
Yeah, no, when I laugh because when I did journalism, I only did a certificate in it, and then you could have gone on to Ainger Street to do the degree at the time, and I thought it was going to make me too cynical because you go in really idealistic, going, you're going to be like the journalists who break all the big stories, and then you learn about how it actually works, and who owns the paper, you know, the ideology of the paper, and all of that. It sort of kind of went, God, yeah, that just sounds awful. So then I somehow ended up in politics, even more cynical profession. So no, it won't be journalism, but I don't know, to be honest, what I'm going to do next.
You must have considered where like you'll remain in politics? I'm
not sure.
Really?
Yeah, I don't know.
Why are you not sure about that?
Well, it's a tough gig first and foremost. I loved the job. Like I absolutely loved being an MEP, and not necessarily because of the policy work, which is really interesting in the committees and the legislation, but because it gives you a platform to help people. And for me, that was the most rewarding part of it. So whether it was those young people or the Stardust families or the campaign for Ibrahim or, to just be able to give people who need a platform to raise their cases. But it is a tough gig, and it takes a lot out of you when you lose a seat. So I'm not sure whether I want to put myself through that again.
Right.
But that could be just
because
it's only a few weeks after the election. Raw. Yeah. So I may change my mind, but I'm considering all options, put it that way.
Okay. Yeah. Well, we'll look forward to see what happens next. Lynn Boylan, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Well, really enjoyed talking to Lynn today. Before we go, please don't forget to subscribe to Ireland Unfiltered on all the usual channels. And if you like the show, and why wouldn't you, please leave a review. Thanks.